I was traveling in Berlin recently, and in the downtown core, in the museum district, I came across a construction site where someone had spray painted a sign that said, in kind of fractured English, "I don't want to write my name, I just want right letters." And this was interesting to me because this was only about a block from the museum in which the very oldest cuneiform writing is housed from about 6,000 years ago in Ugarit, from Ugarit. And it amazed me. I just marveled at the fact that 6,000 years later, someone sensed that the joy of the alphabet was so great that he or she went and bought a can of spray paint and in the middle of the night, I assume it was probably in the middle of the night, went down and sprayed this message just to get letters out into the public. And it reminded me that letters are ubiquitous in our world, and we often don't realize the degree to which they are all around us all the time. And precisely because of that, because they are so ubiquitous, is why we don't notice them often. But of course, they're all over the place in magazines and books and text messages, and even in places we forget that we see them, in street signs and advertising, that we are constantly grappling with these letters, but because it's like breathing, we forget that we even do it. And that led me to start to consider something that I found interesting, which is how the alphabetic letter has conditioned our way of thinking, our way of viewing the world in the West since, in fact, its onset, since its initiation. Of course, the alphabet was invented by the Phoenicians about 3,000 years ago and picked up within a few centuries by the Greeks. And the Greeks knew that this was an extraordinarily powerful tool. In fact, one critic has even suggested that they invented the alphabet so that they could write down Homer's great epics, the Odyssey and the Iliad. In fact, they've viewed it as such a powerful tool that they considered that the alphabetic letters were actually the elements that made up the cosmos. They called them stoikeids, the same word that they used for the elements. So that the alphabet was analogous to the cosmos was analogous to the alphabet. The letters were also numbers. They believed that the world was bound by numbers. Pythagoras said famously, "All is number." And the Romans picked this up. You probably remember that the Roman numerals, in fact, are the letters. That again, the letters speak the mathematical relationships of the cosmos. What's more, the Romans invented what we now call monumental capitals, which are the kind of capital letters that they used on their inscriptions and that we still use to this day. You go to a public building or you look at a great monument, and inevitably the letters are in monumental capitals. That is to say, the Romans understood monumentality, and we still have that monumentality with us in the form of their letters. Here we are in the chapel of Brescia University College, founded by the Ursuline sisters in 1919, and then in 1925-26, they built up on this hill this beautiful neo-Gothic building in which we find ourselves now. It's interesting that it's neo-Gothic because there's actually more neo-Gothic architecture on North American campuses than there is in all of Europe. But the Gothic period, which is to say basically the 13th century, was the period of the first universities in Europe, and as a result, Gothic architecture to this day means university, means place of learning. And so we build all this neo-Gothic buildings, and they're lovely, of course. You can see behind me these stained glass windows made from wonderful glass out of Munich. And this is a fitting place to talk about the shift as we move into the Christian era and the way in which it modified the relationship between the alphabet and the cosmos. At the beginning of the book of the Apocalypse in the Bible, the last book of the Bible, Christ says, I am the Alpha and the Omega. The Alpha, the first letter in the Greek alphabet, the Omega, the last letter. In other words, he says, I'm the whole alphabet. Now, why would he say that? Well, Christ is part of God, and he speaks the language of creation that God used in Genesis. That is to say, language that becomes the cosmos as it's spoken. So again, we have a homology between the alphabet, I am the complete alphabet, and I am the cosmos that I created. And this notion of the relationship between language and world leads to a very interesting idea in the Middle Ages, which is that God wrote two books. God wrote the Bible, and God wrote the book of the world. And you can read either one for your salvation, so that this meant that you didn't have to be literate. You could read the book of the world if you were illiterate. That is to say, you could read the world as so many letters of an alphabetic text for which there were divine signifieds for all the signs of this world. And that notion meant that Christians had to become hermeneuticians. They had to become interpreters. They had to learn to read the world like a text. And this led to many developments in terms of the treatment of the alphabetic letter. So, for example, one had arcane poets in the Carolingian period who, well, for example, Rabanus Maurus, who has a poetic text where you have a grid of the poem going across the page, and then there are illustrated parts, scenes, and if you pick out the letters of the colored parts, there's a second message, so that the crowns of Louis the Pious's, the letters of Louis the Pious's crowns say, Christ, please crown Louis the Pious. In other words, there's a second text behind the first one. Or very often, the different letters had moral values, and the T, for example, was often treated as the cross on which Christ was crucified. So you would get a text where the T actually had Christ on it as he's standing there being crucified. This meant also then that the ABCs were a moral text. And for example, in both French and English, children were taught that when they said their ABCs, they were supposed to make the sign of the cross before they began. And it was actually called, the way we say your ABCs, they called it saying your God's cross, la croix de Dieu. So that the very recitation of these letters had a kind of moral valence. And artists and manuscript illustrators picked up on this and would make historiated letters or geometric letters where you had to grapple with the letter to tease out the meaning behind it. So you wrestled with the letters, and we have images of people wrestling with letters or climbing up a letter toward heaven, because as you interpreted the letters, it led you closer to salvation. Well, as we move beyond the Middle Ages, when we get into the 16th century and the Renaissance, we get yet another take on the way in which the letter and the cosmos and history all come together. But now it's a secularized way. For example, in the great French printer, Geoffroy Tory, created a text on type for printers in 1529 called the Champfleury, in which he said that all letters, he mapped all letters onto the human body, as one would expect, in fact, the male nude, as one would expect in the Renaissance. But also, he said all the letters were made out of the proto-letters I and O, that is to say, straight line and curve. And yes, on one hand, all the other letters are some conglomeration of straight line and curve. But what's interesting is he said the I contained Apollo and the 9 muses, and the O contained Apollo and the 7 liberal arts, which is to say, since every letter is made out of some form of I and O, It means that every time a person wrote a letter with a pen, the ink contained the whole history, the whole tradition of Europe going back to Greco-Roman antiquity that was pouring out onto the page. After the Renaissance, we get an increasing secularization of the letter. By the 18th century, type has become the kind of type we're familiar with, where we simply see the letters in front of us, but we almost wish them away. We just try to read content through the letters and almost forget that we're looking at letters. We're not wrestling with the letters or grappling with the letters. We're trying to figure out what letter it is, but just they seem to wish themselves away so that we have almost direct contact with the content with almost no mediation. But still for us, the ABCs are still part of our entrance into a social and ideological order. Just think of the classic first grade room where you go in and around the top of the room is the whole alphabet, capital A, small a, capitals B, small b there. And of course, as we all know, that's what in first grade children will learn their ABCs. They will learn the whole alphabet. They will learn to make their letters. And this will be a threshold experience that signals their entry into the society, the alphabetic society in which they will dwell for the rest of their life. There have been three great revolutions in terms of how we present alphabetic letters. The first was in the first centuries of the Common Era, when people passed from writing on scrolls to writing in a paginated book. That is to say, the sort of book that we are all familiar with, where you can flip from one page to another. And this was an extraordinary change because it suddenly meant that you could flip back and forth, you could cross-reference between different parts of a text with extraordinary ease, in the same way that a search program can do in a computer now, which had not been the case when people were writing on scrolls and you had to hunt down through the scroll or go pull another scroll because you couldn't get much on each scroll. That changed the way people read. It changed the way people thought. Then the second major revolution was, of course, with the printing press. And because for 1,000 years, the paginated book meant illuminated manuscripts. That is to say, manuscripts that were written by hand on parchment, then later on paper. That meant that every single book had to be individually produced. It was time-consuming, it was expensive, it was for very few people. Very few people knew how to read. But at the beginning, in the mid-15th century, the printing press was invented. And suddenly, you could print hundreds of books at a time, which meant there was this extraordinary democratization of reading, which allowed for more people to be able to read and for books to be much cheaper. At which point, the kind of printed book that we are all familiar with came into being, and we've been doing that for the last 400 years. And then we have the third great revolution. And this is the one that most people around us, we've all lived through. It is the advent of the personal computing devices. The personal computing devices which have changed the way we approach the text. We actually, in fact, all of our letters when we type them, they're actually just ones and zeros, but we don't think of that. We think of them as letters. And of course, we are constantly inputting letters, not just into personal computers, but the iPad, the mini iPad, the iPhone, text messaging, emails. Never have we used alphabetic letters so much as we do now. There may be a fourth revolution around the corner sometime in this millennium. We don't yet know. Very possibly there will be. But there's one thing we do know, and that is that the alphabet is here to stay. People sometimes declare it dead. It will not die. It will not die. Why? Because what was discovered 3,000 years ago is still with us, and that is that a very small amount of letters, only 22 to 26 characters in almost all alphabets, is capable of expressing billions and billions and billions of ideas, new ideas, in a multitude of languages without ever finding itself unable to say what it wants.